all you literary legends and luminaries. I'm Julie and welcome to another episode of Booksmart. Today's book is a memoir entitled Happiness, The Crooked Little Road to Semi-Ever After by Heather Hartman. This book was delightful, although it was not quite what I expected. The back of the book intrigued me. Heather and Brian are essentially opposites and part ways when she becomes pregnant. Studious, meticulous, routine-oriented writer Brian never wanted kids. He stays in New York and she moves back to California. When their daughter is born, the baby isn't healthy. And that's where the love story gets even more complicated. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The premise of the book sold me immediately, yet when I flip through it, the print is pretty tiny, and it's about 300 pages long. Even though I immediately buy it at my used bookstore, it's one of those books I think I'll need to be in the mood for, simply because it looks like a more tedious book that you'll have to be in the right headspace to read, more of a commitment to read it. So it sat in my to-read cabinet for a few months. When I finished You Ought to Do a Story About Me, I haphazardly throw happiness into my bag that I take with me when I teach. I always read for about 10 minutes before my students come into my classroom. I teach at a juvenile detention center, so I'm fortunate not to have hall duty or anything like that. A couple years ago, I started designating 10-minute reading breaks into my workday because I was feeling overwhelmed and stressed and easily aggravated. Once I get my classroom set up for the day, because my classroom is used all the time outside of the school day, and do whatever else needs to be done in the morning, I leave those last 10 minutes to read, to center myself, to put me in a good frame of mind before my teaching begins. It has totally worked. I also read during the 15-minute break between our 2 morning class periods. So I break open Happiness at about 8:20 in the morning, not even sure if I'm in the right mood to read this. I was so upset when the staff brought my students out on time because I didn't want to stop reading it. I was hooked that fast. Harpham has an easy-to-read style that is elegant and literary. It feels effortless to read, not pretentious or preachy, yet surprisingly down-to-earth. I was invested immediately in Heather and Brian's relationship and with the new bundle of joy that had just been born, even though Brian was all the way on the East Coast. Let me read you a piece from the beginning before the baby is born, so you kind of know her style of writing. When I'd finally accepted that I was pregnant and was not going to magically become less pregnant, I called Brian. The phone was an inadequate tool, but it was the only immediate way to bridge a continent. As I dialed, my teeth chattered in intermittent bursts. This is new, I thought. Psychosomatic teeth. Calm down, I told myself. Don't be melodramatic. People get pregnant. But I couldn't calm down. I couldn't even think of how to break the news. I'm pregnant sounded so unoriginal, so teenager in the heartland, and here was the real rub. Too much like something happening exclusively to me. When I finally managed to say it, he melted. My darling, Brian said. My sweetheart. And then he went silent. He was silent for a long time. And when he spoke again, his voice sounded clotted with pain, half aspirated out, as though he literally could not swallow this knowledge. Having kids, what kids do to an adult life already in motion, what they do to romance, to your couch, your car, your time, your money, most of all, your art, had been the constant baseline thrumming through our conversations in the months before I got pregnant. It was the issue that sent us oddly early into therapy together. It was the gun in the room. If he wanted to have kids with anyone, Brian kept saying, it would be with me. If. But if is a wisp of a word. You could hardly hang your hat on that. Oh, it's just lovely how she tells us so much in so little space. It's just beautiful. There is just this easy flow that merges the present action with current reflections and past information. It's lovely. You're right there as part of the action. I wish I could write like this. The beginning jumps back and forth between the past and the present. Because Hartman does this with ease, readers will not get confused or baffled at what is happening, when, or where. And I was so invested in Brian and Heather as a couple. I wanted to smack Brian and tell him to get his butt on a plane to California, and then I wanted to smack Heather and tell her to just let Brian go and find someone else. Yet on some level, I liked both Brian and Heather. I liked them together. You're rooting for them to come together while simultaneously shaking your head and wondering how in the world they had stayed together this long if they didn't have the same future goals. Heather names the baby Amelia Gracie for short. The doctors don't know what exactly wrong with her, only that she cannot produce red blood cells on her own. She will require blood transfusions every couple of months for the rest of her life unless she gets a bone marrow transplant. Without that transplant, she probably won't live into old age. And this is only after doctors have given conflicting information, which I think we can all relate to. Brian flies cross country to see Gracie sometime after she's born. He immediately falls in love with his daughter. Here's an excerpt as Heather and Brian are sitting at a picnic table contemplating their existence. Until this moment, we'd been in near perpetual motion, feeding the baby, walking the baby, changing the baby, side by side, but not face to face. Now we sat on opposite sides of a picnic table and looked at each other. For what felt like a long time, we said nothing. The birds chirped. The light pooled on Gracie's blanket in amber patches. Gracie produced an ongoing babble reminiscent of a fish tank, a comforting, setting stream of watery sounds. I'm sorry I hurt you, Brian said, very simple and very direct, because that was his way. Thank you, I said. We sat there a while longer, looking at each other, glancing over at Gracie on her blanket. She was asleep now with her head tossed back, her ear cocked upward as though listening for an answer to a question only she could hear. Have you seen this? I lifted the silky hair at the base of her neck. There was her strawberry birthmark. I hadn't, Brian said. Thank you for showing me. It began to get dark. The picnic table was wooden and old, splintering. I pulled at slivers of the wood, prying them free. Brian said again, I'm sorry. I stared down at Gracie, watching her chest move rhythmically with a deep breath of sleep. He was sorry? What did sorry even mean in this context? What I wanted most from him was curiosity. I wanted him to ask me how it had been to be alone and pregnant, ask about the day of her birth, every blood transfusion. I wanted him to say, tell me everything, but he didn't ask, and I didn't say. Nor did I ask him what his time alone, as his daughter had been born across the country, had been like. Still, some measure of forgiveness arose between us. Not much, not a tidal wave of forgiveness, more like a capful, a thimbleful. We loved someone in common. That was the start. And here's where the love story starts to take a back seat. And this is my only complaint with the book. Obviously, you cannot develop a love story between Brian and Heather without Gracie, yet the book from here on out is more about Gracie than about Brian and Heather's relationship. Harpham has little passages hither and thither about Brian and about how she feels about Brian and about how they are or aren't getting along, but it's secondary. The main story is about Gracie. Not that this is problematic, it's just the relationship aspects are a bit vague at times. Like as a reader, I'm missing some key moments to fully understand why they are at this particular stage in their relationship. At times, Harpham develops more about her close friends and all their support, which is fine, but such details aren't central to Brian and Heather's relationship. I don't know how many details I should reveal, but I have to tell you this. Heather gets pregnant again. After the doctor suggests they have another baby in the hopes that this baby will be a perfect transplant match for Gracie. Both Heather and Brian say no way for fear they'll have two sick babies. But then, like the first pregnancy, this is an accident. They save the cord blood, which at the time was a novelty, a new procedure that was decided by parents and that parents had to do, not the hospital. After their son is born, named Gabe, the great debate of whether or not they should do the transplant begins. I have to read you this because the image in your head will never leave you, probably for the rest of your life. Imagine 10 children crossing the street, Brian said. 5 girls, 5 boys, in a line holding hands. They cross. On the other side, only 9 arrive. We had been in Brooklyn for about 6 months without Gracie getting any better. We were having an argument, the argument, in our Brooklyn bedroom. I wanted to transplant Gracie. Brian did not. At least not now. The transplant doctors, we had seen many on both coasts, had told us that 1 in 10 children didn't make it through. Transplant carried a mortality risk of at least 10%, maybe higher, 15, 20%. What level of risk was unlivable? I didn't want to think about it, but I knew Brian wasn't arguing for argument's sake. He was terrified. I tried not to picture the children, but it was too late. They had sprung to life. A chatty throng of kindergartners. 5 boys in Velcro superhero sneakers. 5 girls with plastic pastel barrettes holding their limp bangs in place. Are you willing to send Gracie across the street? Brian said. Can you imagine? I mean, it's just tragic. This is the point in the story that I really understand Brian. This was one of the reasons he was hesitant to ever have a family, the fear of having a sick child. Maybe he manifested such a thing, but I now adore Brian. He's reconciling a lot in his world. It's not that he never wanted to be a dad. His decision not to be a dad was based on fear of the unknown and of the uncontrollable. I don't know if Harpham captures this as much in the book as she should, but as I said earlier, the book's focus is not really on Heather and Brian, but on Gracie. Another great thing about this book is it will teach you empathy. My heart breaks for any parent who spends most of their child's childhood in a hospital, and Harpham is lucky. She has enough family resources to not have to worry about working and paying rent, and then her friends have rich connections, so they don't even have to worry about paying all the hospital bills. So now I'm thinking about all the families out there who don't have such resources and all that goes beyond the book, that I'm just distraught for all those families who are having to work 2 jobs or more while living at a hospital. This book will really take you outside your own little world and make you think and make you appreciate the circumstances of your own parenthood, or make you even more grateful you're not a parent. My son is on the autism spectrum, very high functioning, but the time I spent dealing with doctors and educators when he was little, and then the frustration and aggravation and worry and fear, that was nothing compared to what Harpham experienced with Gracie. Yet, then you hope that parents out there who have never had to deal with IEPs or hospitals or mental illness, I hope those parents realize how lucky they are and to stop complaining about petty things. But life is all about perspective, this I know. I can think of several people I would love to send happiness to for a reality check. And for another spoiler in the book, so close your ears if you don't want to hear, they do decide on the transplant. This was a difficult part for me to read because I have issues reading about medical stuff. I've had a fainting problem with blood and needles since I was born. I avoid such books because I cannot read about procedures without getting woozy. I didn't know that chemo is administered with transplants. Long ago, Heather had moved back to New York with Brian, but now they have to relocate to South Carolina for the transplant. Brian has had to fly back and forth to work when he lived in California with Heather and Gracie, and now again during the transplant. Being uprooted like that and not really having a place to call home is just depressing and even more heartbreaking. Once again, it puts all those petty complaints in perspective. Because the title is called Happiness, you have probably already guessed that there is no tragic ending for Brian and Heather and Gracie and Gabe. I'll let you read about all the details in between, which are delightful and sad and confusing and frustrating, just like all relationships can be. Harpham captures the family unit well, how all 4 of them traverse their time together with the help of family and friends along the way. She's excellent at capturing these snapshots while always moving the story forward. Sometimes I'd wish she'd slow it down a bit, especially to develop more about Brian and her relationship. For instance, at one point during all the hospital stays, Brian is getting on her nerves, although he's not doing anything wrong. She's frustrated and also remembering all the time she spent in the beginning by herself. Those are the moments I wish she would develop more, then cut the parts about her friends. I want the focus of the story on Heather and Brian, but it's not. She even manages to develop the relationship she had with the other transplant parents, which once again is fine. There's just so much packed into this book. When I finished it, I thought Harpham could have easily written at least 2 different memoirs out of it, if not 3. What Harpham does best in this book is remind us as parents, and maybe all of us since we were children at one point, that we don't get to pick each other. Her continual gratefulness for Gracie, despite being unplanned and dealing with an illness, is beautiful. She and Brian discuss many times how they didn't earn their daughter. They're awed by Gracie in so many ways, snapshots that Harpham writes about so effortlessly, yet it leaves you breathless. From her writing, I remembered so many of the little things my own son did, things I should capture more on the page. Happiness will leave you feeling happy, despite its dire warning about life in general. I'll close this episode with a paragraph at the end of the book, for Harpham balances such happiness with reality, yet it still leaves you with delight in the end. We have accepted our luck, our daughter and son. We could not earn them. We'll never know if we deserve them, but we hold on with both hands. And still, we understand that nothing given is permanent. Not wealth or well-being, not sweet dreams or morning coffee. Not a daughter or a son, a husband, lover, friend, mother. Anything, everything is up for grabs, can fly back from whence it came. Thanks for watching. As always, my goal at Booksmart is to get a little bit smarter, one book at a time.